Good morning. I'm going to get us started at 9:15. That's now our live stream audience, which might be bigger today because of our weather, is joining us. So thank you for being here. Thanks to the few of you that are in the room. It's a little bit of a slippery morning here in downtown Minneapolis. Today we have Cameron Howard speaking with us. She is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. Her new book is The Old Testament for a Complex World, How the Bible's Dynamic Testimony Points to New Life for the Church. We are really excited to learn from you. Thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks so much for having me. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to you all, and good morning to all the folks I can't see out on the live stream. Glad that you're with us. I'm going to take just a second here to share my screen and make sure I'm all set up. All right. I assume you can see that. If you can't, let me know. Great. Well, I am really excited about your theme for adult education this fall, about building beloved community, and what does that look like from a lot of different angles. And as an Old Testament professor, it won't surprise anyone, I'm sure, that I am always looking to the Bible as a resource for some of the questions that face the world today. And so often, the Old Testament in particular has this reputation for being quite old. And it is, right? I mean, and there is a sense that if it's old, it's somehow out of date or less of a resource for us today. And indeed, it has a lot of stories in it that are strange and difficult and very distant from our own lives today in 21st century United States versus, 2,500 years ago in the ancient Near East. So I know that I always have an uphill climb when it comes to trying to convince people of the Old Testament's importance and relevance for us today. But in fact, this morning, what I want to talk with you about, and next week as well, is indeed, as Rachel said, something I've written about in a recent book called The Old Testament for a Complex World. But I'm going to teach the book this week and next week, so you don't really have to buy it. But there's more in it if you are interested. And the idea is that the Old Testament can help us through today's difficult and sort of puzzling and complex problems, not just because of the things that it says on its pages, not just because of what it says, but rather how the Bible came together, that how its composition and its preservation of multiple voices, its reflection of multiple moments of great change and political upheaval, that there's something in the way that the Old Testament came together that can be instructive for us as we are trying to do work across difference. So my thesis for the next 2 Sundays is this, that the Bible provides possibilities as well as hope for working across difference, not only because of what it says, but also by the way it came together. And so before I dive into how I think that is, I think first it's helpful to check in about what we think we're doing when we're reading the Bible. What are we trying to do? And even in my own teaching, so I teach seminary students, and I often teach them in their very first semester of seminary. So we do a lot of deconstructing of things that they thought they knew about the Bible, and then some reconstruction of possibilities and ways forward. But I noticed in the past that I would use the metaphor kind of excavation to talk about what we're doing with the Bible, that we're sort of mining the Bible for data to try to give us interpretations. And that's what the word exegesis really means. I mean, leading out, this idea that you're pulling things out from Scripture. But at the heart of that metaphor is an idea that there is some sort of static, set core of meaning at the heart of the Bible. And if we could only just dig far enough down or use the right tools, we would get to the right answer. But of course, there's no such thing as the one way or the right way to read the Bible, the singular interpretation that sort of trumps them all and is the right answer. And so this morning, I want to first try to reorient our understanding of reading the Bible with a different metaphor. That instead of reading the Bible as excavation for some core of meaning, that we instead think of the Bible as an atomic particle collision, an atomic collision. And so this is very different. And also I have to refer to the notes in my own book because I had to consult with a dear friend who is he's an MD, PhD physician, as well as a researcher, and also an Episcopalian and a theologian at heart. And so when I asked him about this metaphor, I said, does this work? What is exactly an atomic collision? And he ran with it. He did, in fact, think that it works. So in this analogy, the readers and the text are like atomic particles. Like a solar wind, the Holy Spirit energizes the encounter between text and reader. Every encounter thus has the potential to form new molecules of interpretation, releasing energy as light and beauty. So the picture I have here is of the northern lights, right? The aurora borealis, and which is a result of this sort of solar wind energizing atomic particles and creating this beauty. And so if we think of ourselves as readers, right, always in motion, representing different identities, different contexts, different moments in time, different ideas, that the readers of the Bible are dynamic, right? Always in motion, different from person to person, and also different within ourselves. From one year, one day, one moment, we might read Scripture in one way, and then we pick it up again, having changed ourselves just through living life, and read it in a very different way. So readers, right, are dynamic. That is, they are in motion. What's more difficult, I think, is the idea of thinking about Scripture itself as dynamic, as in motion, as something besides kind of words on a page that are always the same. And indeed, of course, the text that we have received has been written and sort of, it has been, so when I use the word fossilized, that has a very negative connotation, but it's been fixed. And yet, behind those fixed words on the page are many, many centuries of thinking and rethinking what life with God means, and doing that thinking and rethinking in very different political, cultural, economic circumstances for the people of ancient Israel. And what's more, the Bible reflects different voices. So we will look at places where, for example, in Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy has certain ideas about how to worship and where to worship. That worship should always be done at the Jerusalem temple, for example, the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. But when we read the priestly material like Leviticus, it gives very different ideas about what proper worship looks like. And the emphasis is not so much on the place, but on what kinds of animals and what you do to them, etc. So there are differing voices, even right next to each other within the same types of material, that come to different conclusions about what it means to be in relationship with God. And as we will look probably next week at the prophet Ezekiel, Ezekiel had some very clear theological assumptions that he then, after experiencing exile, has to rethink and reconsider. So if we think about the Bible as an atomic particle collision, reading the Bible as this collision between text and reader always dynamic, always in motion, then I think instead of trying to be situated and getting the very correct, right answer, we can sort of open ourselves up to the possibilities, the many different possibilities of biblical interpretation. Now, as you might be thinking, atomic collisions not only create light and beauty, but sometimes they can be very destructive, as in nuclear bombs, right? Things like that. And so I think atomic collision is a helpful metaphor for thinking about the Bible in that way too, that it can create a lot of beauty, but we all know has also been used in the act of interpretation has been used in very destructive ways. So that's something also to keep in mind. So with that metaphor laid out there, I want to talk about 3 biblical modes of innovation. That is, what are 3 ways that the Bible shows this dynamism, that the way that the Bible came together reflects rethinking, reconsideration, always in conversation, always in movement, rather than this sort of static text that we might assume. The first one is adapting popular culture, that we can look at multiple places in the Old Testament. I say the Bible, but I'm really mostly talking about the Old Testament because that's my wheelhouse. The places that the Old Testament adapts popular culture, uses existing literature or tropes or themes or ideas, and then redeploys them to make new points about the life of ancient Israel and ancient Israel's God. So the Bible adapts popular culture. It rethinks theological assumptions, as I mentioned already with Ezekiel, for instance. Ezekiel thought that God was always to be found in the temple. And then when Babylon besieges Jerusalem and the temple is gone, the question is, and Ezekiel himself is in exile, where is God? Is God only to be found in the temple? And if there is no temple, where has God gone? So even within his own life, Ezekiel has to rethink, what do I know about God and how do I know it? And then finally, developing new genres. So the Old Testament contains actually quite inventive new ways of writing literature. And I think that the genre of apocalypse, which is found not only in the Old Testament book of Daniel and the New Testament book of Revelation, but also in a lot of Second Temple literature that is not included in the Bible, reflects times of great political upheaval. And so the Jewish thinkers of the Second Temple period are very creative in, again, trying to think, how do we communicate our understanding of God in new ways in a new time? So in our time together today and next week, I'm going to walk us through an example of each of these modes of innovation. For adapting popular culture, we're going to look at the Jewish court stories that are represented in Daniel 1-6. These are those beloved Sunday school stories like the fiery furnace, or Daniel in the lion's den, that there was existing literature. This was a favorite way to tell a story and a favorite theme for a story in the early post-exilic period. We'll look at Ezekiel for rethinking theological assumptions, and then we'll look at the second half of the book of Daniel as an example of developing a new genre. And that by looking at the ways that the biblical writers were doing innovation, were in conversation with each other and with their own tradition, it provides us some hope that the Bible itself might inspire in us new ways to think about life together and life with God together in a rapidly changing world. So Daniel, the book of Daniel is odd. So some things about it. First of all, it's probably the latest book in the Old Testament to have been put together, that its final form dates from the 2nd century BCE, so the 100s. So it's very late in the biblical timeline. But it contains material that is set much earlier and that also probably dates from much earlier. So the court stories that we find in chapters 1 through 6 reflect an earlier, probably oral tradition, a set of stories that circulated independently, and then later were put together with the kind of strange and unsettling things in the apocalypse, that is apocalypse as a genre of literature that we find in 7 through 12. But one thing that's peculiar about it is that Daniel is also in 2 different languages. Daniel has parts of it that are in Hebrew and other parts that are in Aramaic. But the Hebrew and Aramaic divisions don't align with the divisions of genre. So you have chapter 1 and then chapters 8 through 12 that are in Hebrew. And then in the middle, you have chapters 2 through 7 that are in Aramaic. What we need to know about Aramaic, first of all, is that it was the lingua franca of empires that ruled over Judah or had exercised some pressure or control over Judah from the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BCE. And then subsequent empires kept Aramaic as the language of business and administration. So you would have scribes who were schooled in Aramaic no matter what their native language was, because that was the language of business and commerce and communication among kings and that sort of thing. And so you also hear in the book of Daniel, we're going to see a lot of emphasis on the scribal life. So Daniel and his friends, right, are educated to be scribes. And so we're very much in Daniel getting the perspective of the people who were literate at this time, right? They were trained in multiple languages and in reading and writing. And so it has a very sort of scribal feel to it. So that's one reason that Aramaic is probably that Aramaic would have been part of the book of Daniel, because the stories in 1 through 6 tell stories of kings. Then again, they don't align, and so there's something about the scribal identities of the authors that, you know, there are some theories, but nobody knows exactly for sure. So Daniel. Daniel is a Jewish court story, as I've said. There are actually multiple Jewish court stories we can identify in the Hebrew Bible. The book of Esther, the stories of Joseph in Genesis 37 through 50, as well as Daniel 1 through 6. So what do I mean by court story? Well, think about each of these stories. You have a Jew who finds himself or herself in some position of power or as an insider in the court of a foreign king. So Esther, is taken into the court of Ahasuerus, who is Xerxes, a Persian king. You have Joseph, who finds himself, of course, second to Pharaoh in Egypt. And then in Daniel 1-6, there are actually several kings. Each story tends to have a different one and a sort of different encounter. And sometimes it's Daniel and his friends. Sometimes it's just Daniel, and sometimes it's just the friends. But when this Jew is in the court of the foreign king, they find themselves in a position to, first of all, sort of face a line drawn in the sand, a moment of courage or of using their power to save themselves or their people. So you think about Esther, who has to go into the king unsummoned and try to intervene because Haman has decreed by manipulating the king's power that all Jews must be murdered. And then you have Joseph, who can interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and he finds himself in a position, of course, to help his father and his brothers when there is famine in Israel. And then Daniel 1-6, right? The boys, the lads, Daniel and his friends, either exhibit great piety or refuse to bow down to an idol, or somehow other use their piety or a kind of supernatural gift to either they survive the king's attempts on their lives, or otherwise are able to thrive by not capitulating fully to the empire. And this was, we know, a very popular way of storytelling. We know that not just because of the multiple examples that are in the Bible, but also outside of the Bible, the existence of the story of AHIKAR. The story of AHIKAR has been found in multiple languages, including Aramaic, Syriac, Greek, Ethiopic, that Ethiopic needs another I, and Armenian. And over time, we know that thus the story of AHIKAR was copied in scribal circles. One of the ways scribes would have learned was by copying out existing texts, sometimes bureaucratic, boring ones, but also wisdom sayings or other kinds of stories. It was composed itself in Aramaic in the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, and it used pre-existing proverbs. So AHIKAR is a wise man in the court of the Neo-Assyrian king, and he is associated with proverbs that are worked into his story. The earliest existing manuscript that we have dates from the 5th century BCE, and it was found at the Jewish military garrison at Elephantine, Egypt. And so there was a thriving diaspora Jewish community in Egypt, and this manuscript of AHIKAR in Aramaic was found there, which gives us evidence that Jewish scribes knew this story. But it's not a Jewish story originally. AHIKAR itself is a West Semitic name. So from, if we're looking at a map, right, the western areas of the ancient Near East, but he serves in an Assyrian court in the East. So he is a foreigner, as it were, in that court. And he is beloved by the king, and he has taken his nephew Nadan into his care to sort of raise him as his successor in the king's court. But for whatever reason, the nephew betrays him and falsely accuses him of sedition. And so AHIKAR is to be executed. But he uses his a previous relationship, a friendship that he has with the executioner, and they conspire together to put another prisoner's corpse in his place. And AHIKAR goes into hiding. And eventually, the king needs Ahikar again because the king of Egypt has challenged him to this sort of wisdom challenge in which some tribute, some great treasure is to be exchanged depending on who wins. And the king thinks, I wish I had Ahikar. And then there's this big reveal where Ahikar shows himself to still be alive and is able to solve the king's problem. And so you hear that wise courtier who faces some sort of existential crisis and is able through wit and wisdom and sometimes this is more evident in the Jewish court stories than in this one, but some degree of piety to then save himself and triumph in the end. So this was a favorite story of scribes that was copied and translated and widely disseminated across the ancient Near East. In other words, it was ancient Near Eastern popular culture. Here I did have a map for you for Ahikar. So he has a Western Semitic name. So he was from somewhere near the Mediterranean Sea versus the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and which was headquartered in the east, right around Nineveh. And you can also see here, though, the great reach of the Assyrian Empire itself in the 7th century BCE. All right, so if Ahikar is an example of popular culture, how does Daniel 1 fit in with it? And what is different about Daniel 1 from the story of Ahikar and from other stories? I have put the text of Daniel 1 on these slides, but I'm sure it's very difficult to read. So I'll read it out loud, but if you have a Bible nearby, or you can, find it on a smartphone if you'd like to read along, but I will just read aloud Daniel chapter 1. And as I read, listen for, first of all, any similarities you might hear to the little summary of Ahikar that I gave, or what you know about the Joseph story or the Esther story. But then also, why would this kind of story have been popular for diaspora Judaism in the post-exilic period? Now, a quick aside, just a refresher on your Old Testament history. Diaspora means scattered, right? And then at the exile, around 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes and besieges Jerusalem, and this is after sort of there are stages that lead up to it. But in 586, Jerusalem is besieged, and the people suffer. The Book of Lamentations tells of the great starvation that happened at this time, the nature of siege warfare. And the temple is destroyed. The king is imprisoned, and the elites of Judah are exiled to Babylon. So things are looking pretty bleak. But at that time, diaspora communities are established in Babylon and in Egypt. And then in 539 BCE, King Cyrus of Persia defeats Babylon and allows Jews who would like to return to Jerusalem, perhaps even compels some of them. That's another question for another day. Cyrus allows Jews who have been exiled to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and reestablish life there. And some do, but some remain in diaspora communities. Okay, so at the beginning of Daniel 1 here, we will hear the setting, which is actually during the time of exile. So, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every brand of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Chaldeans just means Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine, so he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel asked the guard, whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations, and deal with your servants according to what you observe. So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into visions and dreams. At the end of the time that the king had set for them to be brought in, the palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among them all, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel continued there until the first year of King Cyrus. So I'm wondering if anybody has any just first observations after hearing this text in light of this whole idea of a court story or of life in diaspora. Any comments?
I have the mic. I can run. I heard someone make a noise over here. Was that you? No? I don't see any yet. I'm looking live stream, nothing here.
All right, that's all right. I'll offer some, but if anybody raises a hand, feel free to jump in. I know it's a kind of difficult format for conversation, but you'll notice the way that, first of all, think about the young men's experience in exile. So I'll see if I can go back to the beginning here. So they have been taken from their homeland and conscripted into palace work. They are from the royal family and nobility, and you'll notice how picky the king is, right? Young men without physical defect and handsome. And they are already considered wise and competent. And so they are to be taught a new language, new literature, given new food, and even new names, right? So they have come from their homeland against their will to a new place, given new names, new food, new literature, and new language to learn. And there's something about the food that is the line in the sand, right? Daniel resolved at verse 8, he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. He would not take the king's food. Maybe this is a question of kosher, but maybe not, actually. It's just something about the royal food is a bridge too far for Daniel, because kosher does not mean a vegetarian diet. That's why I say that. But Daniel says he will have only vegetables. He will not have the rich food and the wine of the palace. But notice the layers of sort of imperial pressure that are working here. He asks the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. But the palace master says, if you waste away, that's on my head, right? I'm in charge of you, and the king will see that it's my fault. So you would endanger my head with the king. And so then Daniel goes to the guard whom the palace master had appointed over them and said, just let us try for 10 days, give us vegetables and water. And if we look like we're wasting away, then you deal with that. We accept that. And so through this it never says exactly that God let them flourish, right? But to them, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature. And there's this idea in the background, sort of theologically, that God is at work here. But God is not sort of a forward character in the story. Rather, that's kind of the background, a kind of theological shadow, as it were, that comes over, but shadow in a good way, that comes over these stories. But that they're very much about identity, right? What does it mean to come to a new place and to retain what parts of your identity are you trying to retain? What would be a bridge too far? What is it okay to capitulate on, and where does resistance start? If we think also about the book of Esther, right? For Esther, she is brought against her will, conscripted into sexual slavery in the house of the king. There's like a tryout, that it's essentially a sex contest, right? You spend one night with the king, and then the one he likes the best is the one who becomes the new queen. And so in the middle of all of this violence, her uncle Mordecai finds out that Haman has this great edict that he has had issued for genocide against the Jews of Susa, this Persian capital. And Esther, she is able to win the king's favor through some sort of basically supernatural ability to listen to, she gets the cosmetic treatments from the eunuchs in the harem, and but she has some sort of gift that enables her to rise up and to not be executed when she goes unsummoned to the king, and then for Haman to be the one who ends up on the gallows instead of Mordecai. And if we think of the Joseph story, I think the Joseph story is the one that has the most kind of clear parallels to AHIKAR, where Joseph there, who is, in prison. You think about AHIKAR befriending the executioner, but there is wisdom that Joseph shows, dream interpretation. So Daniel and Joseph are able to interpret dreams, again, a kind of supernatural gift. And Joseph, remember, refuses the advances of Potiphar's wife. That's what gets him into trouble in the first place. but he rises in power, right? And then it's that power that he gets in the foreign court that enables him to save the sons of Israel, Jacob and his brothers. So all of these resonate with a people, you can imagine, in diaspora, right? So that if we think about how many stories in the Old Testament are about life in the land of Judah or Israel around the temple, there are a lot of those. But there are also these stories that took hold in the post-exilic period when diaspora Judaism was beginning to flourish, that are wrestling with these ideas of identity, how to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, right? To quote Psalm 137, how to be outside the land and still maintain a particular identity. And so something about this type of story really took hold. And I think, so when we're sort of transitioning to thinking about what does that mean for us today, of course, the content of these stories is profoundly, I think, interesting when we think about questions of immigration and identity, or any time that one is outside of a homeland, outside of a community, and trying to forge a new identity. You can think of, actually, I'm sure, several other scenarios or issues when these kinds of stories might be instructive. But I also want us to sort of pause and acknowledge that these stories take existing ideas from the surrounding culture and redeploy them to talk specifically about Jewish identity, as well as a kind of theological assertion that God, even though backgrounded, continues to be active in the world. God is giving these nudges here and there, and that it means something to exhibit piety, to refuse idolatry, right? To stand against idolatry. And so the Bible is in conversation constantly with the world around it. And so I think so too for Christians to reflect on what it means to be constantly in conversation with the world around us, but to have a particular story to tell or a particular nuance to give to the world's stories. So I think additional questions for reflection for me on this idea of adapting popular culture as a way that the Bible shows innovation, I think prompts us to act. What are the foundational stories of our communities? Who tells them, and how are they being told? Whose stories are not being told or heard, and how do we listen for those untold or unheard stories? Because there are a lot of different stories out there, right? And the church intersects with stories in different and dynamic ways, right? Atomic collisions in ways that can generate newness and beauty. So let me pause there for a second and see if there are any questions or comments about either Daniel or adapting popular culture, or responses to the questions on the screen there.
Thanks. Brent has a question.
I have a quick question. I was intrigued by your comments about how late this was added to the Old Testament. And I'm, sort of curious what that process would have been. I can't imagine it was similar to what we know about the formation of the New Testament. But I'm curious, to what extent people would have been saying, there's something in this story that it is impactful for us now. There's something that makes this story something that we need to hear. Maybe it's essentially an internal exile when you're conquered by Rome, that we can still be the righteous remnant that the leadership was during the diaspora. But I'm just sort of curious to what, if anything, you know about how it was just general acceptance. If this shows up in a few synagogues throughout the Jewish world, do people all of a sudden assume now it's just part of that? I assume it was a lot more informal process than, I'm blanking on the Council of Nicaea or whatever
right.
some of the early biblical texts were.
Right. Yes. So never, in terms of the canonization of the, so to speak, canonization of the Hebrew Bible in Jewish tradition, was there some sort of great council like we know the church councils to be. But the book of Daniel is interesting because then that second half, which we'll get to go into detail some next week, that the second half has this apocalyptic literature that can be dated with great precision to the persecutions of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Seleucid, one of the successor dynasties of Alexander the Great, around 167 to 164 BCE. And so the whole of Daniel, it seems that new stuff, that apocalyptic stuff that's written in the time of these persecutions, is put together somehow with these earlier stories that would have circulated separately. And that apocalypse is told as if it's from Daniel in the earlier time, making a prophecy about the future, about the second century, basically. And so that's one reason that putting those texts together serve the purposes of the whole, that if you could take this, earlier figure, Daniel, who was associated with wisdom, he was associated with God's special favor, and he was associated with some really great stories that people enjoyed. I think we shouldn't downplay that either, that, just stories take hold because they're good stories sometimes too. And so that complex of stories gets put with Daniel, the visionary, the one who had visions, who could interpret dreams, who's then given in a new age that's full of terror, a word from God in the past that then can be read, and we can see when Antiochus is persecuting Jews, we can see, this wise figure from the past told us that this was going to happen, but that God has a plan for the future, for the end of this. So I think just in terms of the internal thematics, that the use of the Daniel figure as the existing wise visionary figure will become important for Daniel, the one who can receive the apocalyptic vision. But as for how it is eventually that the canonization of the Hebrew Bible happened, particularly in Jewish tradition, we know at the time of Jesus that there is the law, Moses and the prophets, right? Jesus refers to Moses and the prophets. We know also, though, that at the Dead Sea, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, every book, if we take Ezra and Nehemiah as one book, which it originally was, every book that is currently attested in the Hebrew Bible was found at the community at the Dead Sea, except for Esther, which itself was also probably late. But of course, we don't know if that was about omission or if that's just an accident of history, right? It just didn't survive. But we know that there were certain texts that the scribes clung to, the scribal class, the ones who would have been copying things. And I think when we think about canonization, to think about the texts that were most formative and meaningful for a community, for whatever reason, are the ones that kind of rose to the top. But when it comes to putting a formal stamp or knowing exactly how that shook out, we don't know, especially for the later books like Daniel.
Another question from Dwayne.
Yeah, and thank you for your presentation and your work. So you talk about a court, and in our day, we would think, well, a court of law, we go there to insist upon justice. But the story is framed as the court, like royal courts, kings. not to say that one's exclusive of the other, but here we have power represented in Daniel, which is a representation of God's power, and the kings, the king of Israel, who's somehow failing, it appears, and the Babylonian king. But over all of those is God, who is king. Is God still seen as king? So my question about courts and your questions here is something like, so who tells, in other words, whose court are we in when we read the book of Daniel? And where is that court located? And are we talking about the operations of laws or the operations of human kings, or the operation of divine king or divine human king? And what has that to say about how we do listen for the untold and unheard? It seems like law has to do with the enforcement of what's already, even though that's in some form of change. But here you seem to bring in the element of what can be new, which seems to be fundamentally a different category than just law or its development.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. And first of all, yes, thank you for raising up that clarification, which is important. That court here refers to like a royal court, those surrounding the king, versus the judicial court. Though you're right that depending on the culture and the place, that there was some overlap sometimes in those. But I think this question about like sort of who's telling the story and whose law and whose court is front and center is really helpful, because you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, so if I can back up just a little bit to 1 Samuel 8, there's this famous passage in 1 Samuel 8 when the people ask for a king, and God says they shouldn't ask for a king because I'm their king. But then they say, okay, well, I'll give them a king, but this is the king will take and take and take. And that's what happens. And that sort of is a story that leads down into exile. So there's this historical kind of reevaluation from exile about those Israelite and Judean kings, and what went wrong with kingship there that meant that the promises made to David, the promises even made to Abraham, right, of living in the land, have been, it seems, lost. And so that is couched in Samuel and Kings as the people have broken the covenant, and therefore exile is a curse that comes from breaking of the covenant. But then, right, there is this rethinking. Okay, we don't have a king. What do the promises to David mean? What does living under the law mean? Now, Persia actually let Judah have its own law. It was part of Persian rule to have actually each of its colonies, as it were, write down a law and live under it. And so there's some thought that the Persian authorities probably signed off on the Torah, or at least knew that the Torah existed, which is another kind of interesting question or line of scholarship. But I think that your question is right at the heart of what some of these stories are trying to work out in terms of whose law do we follow? Do we follow the Torah? Do we follow the law of the Babylonian or Persian king? And what can we let go of? And what do we not let go of? Sort of what parts of that ancient text, right, as times change, as we find ourselves unable to worship at the temple, etc., like, where is it that we draw a line? And I think that kind of storytelling can be very instructive in Christian community, living in a world, right, beset by greed and whatever kinds of evil forces you want to name, right? What does it mean to be in the world, but not of the world, right? To borrow some New Testament phrasing there. Where is it, right, that we learn to refuse idolatry? Where is it? So, and then another, just really quickly, one aspect of your question that comes to mind too is that not all the stories of diaspora or of exile are recorded in the Hebrew Bible. So we get these scribal stories. They don't tell us the stories of the people who remained in the land under imperial rule who weren't exiled. And so I think that there's something about the focus on these Danielic scribal stories that also reminds us of what is absent. They bear the trace of the things that are not said, right? And so that that as we examine these stories that adapt this very popular theme, what are the stories that are behind there that weren't even told? And it's still more, right, what gets left out. So great, lots of rich things to think about there. Thanks.
I do have one question from the live stream. We actually might lose the live stream, so this might be something to bookmark for next week even. But Ken is asking, Daniel assumed the burden of proof that eating differently would be successful. He took on all the risk. How do we shift the burden of hearing other stories onto ourselves, demonstrating shared risk?
Oh, lovely question. Yeah, I think that's maybe I'll pick up. I see we're at 10:11, so that means maybe we've lost the live stream. But
right. And Ken being on the live stream might be good for us to reserve this question for next time. So I'll copy and paste it and send it to you via email, and maybe we can just bookmark it for a continuing conversation, if that's okay with you.
That sounds great. I'll start with it next time.
Perfect. Yeah, a whole week to think about it. Thank you very much for being with us. We look forward to being with you again next week for part 2 about demonstrating our faith in tumultuous times, I think is the title. So, and thank you to those who are here as well as those who are on the live stream. We are excited about this season of Adult Ed, and we're looking forward to next season as well. If you are hearing questions in your mind about this theme that you're hoping we would explore, we do have a few spots open next winter and spring to kind of explore some things in greater detail. So let me know if that's the case. Thanks so much for being here. I hope this week goes well for you. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.